Hi, and welcome to the first episode of our East Asian series. And today we're going to talk about an introduction to East Asia. For those of you who are familiar, please uh, sit down and wait as I explain the rules to those who may not be as familiar. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing today. And I'm going to try and present these things from a secular perspective, not trying to weight any of the particular cultures or identities when I give this presentation. I like to say that these kinds of presentations can be controversial. They may talk about issues or problems or perspectives that may be troubling or other or may not land as well. And so I encourage people to be respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time during the presentation. Alternatively, you can wait until we get to 2 hours when there will be a Q&A. And at that point, I'm more than happy to take people who want to speak up and ask their question or take questions as well from the chat. What I like to say is that these presentations, these classes are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And a 201 meaning that if you already know some of the base material I'm going to cover, don't worry. I'm going to go probably more in depth than you're familiar. What I like to also say is that there's a 2 hour hard stop. So at 9 p.m., if I don't get through all my slides, that's okay. We'll just roll it over into the next week. And we will go to the Q&A at that moment. So that way you know that at 2 hours, you're not going to lose any additional information from the presentation. When I put dates below a person, if they're a political figure, that's when they were serving in that political role. If I put dates below a philosopher or thought leader of some kind, those are their dates of life. This is going to be a recording, so you may watch it later on our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page to see all of our different series, including my Middle Eastern history series that I've wrapped up, our Ukraine and Israel war series that have continued, and a number of other different series and developments, Powerful Women that Jane Prendergast is still giving. And of course, if you want to be in the Zooms, if you want to participate and ask questions, we'd love to have you. Please join our meetup. The meetup link is there. And if you feel that what we've been doing has been enriching you, of course, we're going to continue to give these presentations for free, but we do appreciate you helping to keep the lights on if you value what we're doing. So our PayPal link and our Buy Me a Coffee link are in the description. So that way you can continue to make this a viable option for us. All right. So the first thing that we really need to understand when we talk about East Asian culture, and we'll define what that is geographically, we'll define what that is, in terms of systems and philosophies further on. But one of the things that I really wanted to discuss first off is the presence of high context speech and indirect speech. And this is very common in East Asia and something that's very difficult when you compare it to low context speech and culture, which exists in the West, especially in Anglo and Northern European cultures like Germanic, Scandinavian, English, and U.S. American. So the fundamental distinction between these two, the high context culture and the low context culture, is that a lot of things are implied or inferred due to circumstance. And we'll go through some of these examples, but I just sort of wanted to give an example that might sort of fit in a Western society in the way that people will speak in a high context situation. So imagine that two people are about to give a presentation and they're in the planning stages for it, and one of them turns to the other one and says, "This will be like Frodo in the Ring," and the other one says, "No, it's probably going to be more like Germany in World War I." And the first one then says, "Sure, but we could hit a home run if we do it well enough," right? The first person might be referring to the story of Frodo in the Ring to symbolize the idea that, like in the Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo needed to gather companions together to make a team using their different skills. And so instead of saying, I need to bring together a team that uses different people's skills in order to accomplish this mission, and it might be tedious and difficult, they're saying this will be like Frodo in the Ring, leaving all of that context up to the knowledge of the other listener. And the other listener seems to know that context, right? Because he responded, no, I think it's going to be more like Germany in World War One. And that person would be relying on the historical context as opposed to the literary context in the first case of right. Germany in World War One was sandwiched between two difficult, powerful states, the French and British on one side, the Russians on the other, and was pulled down by their erstwhile allies, the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans, who didn't really contribute, and that Germany really had to fight the war for anyway. So he's saying, no, I think that actually there's probably going to be one person who's going to lead the team, and everybody else is going to a weight on that person, and like the timeline and our bosses are like two opposing enemies, fighting over us, and it's going to make it really difficult for us, right? And the first person responds with an analogy to sports that they understand, right? This is going to be a home run if we do it correctly. So um and you can see how much it took to unpack and to work through all these different metaphors and ideas that refer to culture, literature, that refer to history and perception, that refer to all these different elements. And this is the kind of speech that we generally see in East Asia, this sort of extremely high context speech. Um, it's even more high context than some of the speech that we see in the Middle East, where similar kinds of metaphors and ideas are constantly in play that you need to continually unpack in order to understand what people are really saying and what they're really trying to do. Um, so because you need to create this high level of contextual framework to understand what different individuals are saying in East Asia, we should understand what that sort of looks like in terms of its development, right? So we have within a community of a high text culture society, you necessarily have strong bonds with those affiliated with the family or the community, right? Because that's how you share all these historical metaphors, these uh, conversational perceptions, and so on. And of course, that also leads it to being that there's a strong distinction between those who are part of the society, those who recognize those metaphors, those cultural markers, and those that don't. And that's a fundamental distinction, right, between a low context culture like the West, where people sort of interact as individuals in a larger society, and we don't share a lot of cultural touchstones. Uh, there are certain things that we all come to understand because we're growing up in a Western society, but people are allowed to be different. And in fact, we embrace the difference. In these context societies, if you're different and you don't understand what's going on, you'll clearly miss the conversations that are happening. Another piece that sort of builds on this individual versus community aspect is that in the West, if a person does something wrong, the guilt is assumed by the person. You have this sense that the person has done something wrong, but their family members, the wider society, there's nobody in particular to blame for the wronggoing. I just wanted to comment on the chat. I don't have any plans for Southeast Asia. If somebody else does, then they'll do it then. Um, but you have the situation with the community not being responsible for the guilt of the individual. In East Asian society, because of the high context culture, because of the strong family bonds and the connectivity, every individual's action is a reflection of the family from which he comes. So if he does something positive, it's not his honor, it's the honor of the family. And if he does something negative, it's not his guilt, but it's the shame of the family. And so you have this entire concept of face that develops in East Asia, where oftentimes it's more important to maintain face, to maintain the family's honor, than it is necessarily to get the quote right answer. And this is very common as an issue today in business culture, where if you're interacting as a Westerner with an East Asian business and you are forthright in telling an East Asian partner or a client or similar that they did something wrong, it could damage the relationship far more than if you accepted the wrong thing and tried to find ways to mitigate it without harming the person's reputation, even if it's a loss in business and similar. And you have this very much playing a role in people's decisions and people's thought processes as we'll move through different parts of history. And so, one of the ways that this sort of communication, this shame and guilt, these ideas begin to manifest are in what's called indirect speech, where two people will purportedly have a conversation about subject X, but in truth, they are having a conversation about subject Y, and both of the speakers are aware of this possibility. There's a famous children's story that's often told about the king who wants to execute a peasant for some trivial violation. And so his first minister is talking to the king and asking him what he wants what the king would want that the first minister would say when executing this peasant. And so they have a conversation, and the first minister will say things like, and so you want me to convey to him that the king got so perturbed by the peasant's minor infraction that death was the necessary respite. Um, and things of that nature, where the conversation seems to be about what should we say to this erstwhile criminal, when in reality, it's really the first minister trying to communicate to the king without directly approaching the king about it, that he should not execute this person, that the infraction was so trivial that it's ridiculous and he should be set free. But never does he say that those things. He only says that the king might be embarrassed to have gotten so angry over over such a thing by making it seem incredulous that he would tell the prisoner of those things. So we're going to see a lot when we look at the interior as we go through this series in terms of the courts and the dealings at the higher levels of government of this sort of cloak and dagger approach where people don't necessarily say what they're intending to do, but they say something that will infer to their partner or their interlocutor what they're going to do. And because of that, a lot of things become a little bit more nebulous when you're discussing these sort of societies because not everything is necessarily spelled as clearly out as we might like. So the next thing I want to sort of talk about is what are the borders of East Asia? Now, there are five or six, depending on how you count them, countries that I'm going to talk about over the course of this series. And that's the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea, um, the Empire of Japan, and the Socialist State of Vietnam. And one of the things that we have to take into account is that in many cases, the borders of these countries as they currently exist are the result of the freezing of an imperial ambition. Let me explain exactly what I mean here. And to a lesser extent, we'll talk about Mongolia as well. All of the countries that we have today, with the exception of uh, the two Koreas, if we can say, were states that expanded as imperial projects. And in fact, throughout their different time periods, they controlled territories that were less than what they control now and controlled territories that are more than what they control now, depending on the situation and the changing times. In particular, if we take a look at the Chinese borders, right? I wanted to compare, for example, the PRC's borders, which you can see on the map on the left-hand side in yellow, with those of the Sui dynasty, which existed about 1500 years ago in that map in orange. If you notice, the China that exists in the Sui dynasty is less than half of the physical territory of the People's Republic of China today. And the reason for the difference in size is that the territory controlled by the People's Republic of China is a direct result of the expansions that occurred during the 16, 17, and 1800s, as the Qing Empire was able to expand further west and further south and further north than the North China Plain. We're going to talk a little bit about what that is and how that operated as a center of China. In terms of controlling and subjugating other regions that had not historically been a part of China or not consistently been a part of China. And we're going to talk about the certain vassal and territorial relationships that existed. In the same way, Vietnam, we think of it as this sort of snake-like S country that starts from the Chinese border and goes all the way down through uh, to almost to the border of Cambodia, and even has the southernmost point outside of Thailand and Malaysia on the Asian mainland in Southeast Asia, and Singapore, obviously. But I want to draw your attention to the map in the upper right-hand side, which shows that Vietnam really started as a small territory, relatively speaking, compared to its current territory now, that bordered China and only the northern part of Laos, that really light green portion of that map. And as the centuries progressed, and you can see the timeline on the right-hand side, the Kinh people, the dominant ethnic group of Vietnam, conquered more and more territories further and further south. In fact, that area in blue and purple was the territory controlled by the Chams, which are a completely unrelated ethnic group that the Kinh eventually conquered and subjugated. Now, Vietnam today has majority Kinh in every province, but it won't be surprising to learn that there's a far greater density of Kinh in the northern part of Vietnam than there are in the southern part of Vietnam. And furthermore, Vietnam has expanded westward from its original position to a certain degree over and different periods, and that's been up into the mountain regions where Kinh have never been the majority, even to this day. And of course, those who served in the Vietnam War would know this well in the sense of the majority of the anti-communist forces that fought alongside the Americans in the Vietnam War were exactly these minorities from South Vietnam. Um, and therefore they were resistant to a Kinh nationalism, which was part and parcel of the communist ideology advocated by Ho Chi Minh. And we'll talk about that, how that communism is nationalism, when we finally get to the Vietnam War, probably sometime next year. But we have this idea of constantly expanding empires. I wanted to also point to Japan. We think of Japan as a country made of four key islands. We have Hokkaido in the north. We have Honshu as the main island on which Tokyo sits. We have Shikoku, which is a smaller main island just south of Honshu, and Kyushu to the southwest of Honshu. But if you look at this map from the Sengoku Jidai, which is from 1564 to 1573, that's when this map is roughly dated to, and it shows the different daimyo or warlords that controlled different parts of Japan. Japan was not a united country in this period. But you can notice something immediately off about this map, which is that this map does not contain Hokkaido on it, that northernmost island of Japan. And the reason it doesn't is because Hokkaido, with the exception of some regions toward the southernmost part of south and westernmost part of the island, the part that's closest to Honshu, was not under the control of the Yamato ethnic group, the Yamato being the dominant ethnic group of Japan, what we in lay terms call Japanese. And since the Yamato didn't control Hokkaido, and it was in control of the indigenous Ainu people and their quasi representatives with the Yamato merchants further south, they didn't include it on this map because it simply wasn't a key part of Japan. And that wouldn't change until the early 1800s when Japan's industrialization allowed it to conquer the territory more and more completely. The same can be said about the Ryukyu island chain, which stretches between Kyushu and Taiwan. And this island chain is controlled by Japan. It has been for centuries, but it wasn't always that way. They were an independent kingdom for many centuries, at least 4 or 5 centuries. We have trade that will go from China through the Ryukyu to Japan, even when both countries are in theory isolated. So those Ryukyu islands had their own governing system and organization. And in the West, we're probably most familiar with the capital of the Ryukyu Islands, that's Okinawa, which was the second island in the main Japanese chain that the United States invaded during World War II. But these islands were not historically a part of Japan. until Japan conquered them as part of its growing imperial aspirations. So we've talked about Vietnamese imperial aspirations, Chinese imperial aspirations, Japanese ones. You can see the kingdom of Balhae, which is called by Koreans to be a Korean kingdom. There are others who will say that it belongs to uh, a mixture of Koreans and indigenous people of that part of Siberia, like the Ebeng um, and the Mo. But Balhae is considered by many this sort of Korean empire. And you can see it's a Korean empire that controls territories that are now part of China and part of Russia. So we have to be flexible with our understanding of what these countries are and recontextualize them in the periods that we're talking about, because the snapshot that we have today is a direct result of the modern systems of organization that Europeans imposed around the world, the Westphalian system. We'll talk more about that throughout this presentation. But because of the Westphalian system, borders that existed at the time of Western imperialism, the late 19th century, early 20th century, became those that are now frozen in the states that are the successor states. So that's why China controls territories like Tibet and Xinjiang in the western part of the country, which don't or didn't until very recently have Han majorities. Um, and places like Vietnam have their largest cities, like Saigon in the south, as uncontestedly Vietnamese, despite the Vietnamese only conquering the city roughly um, roughly 400, 300, 400 years ago. So we should understand that when we're talking about this East Asian sphere. And in fact, sorry, yeah. So I wanted to show this map for a second, and we'll go back in a second to talk about what's going on. But this map reflects in many ways what the imperial cores were of these Asian states before they expanded, before they became empires, and had their modern borders crystallized. And you can see in orange the Chinese heartland, the North China Plain. We'll talk about that in a bit. You can see the Korean Peninsula, the southern three islands of the Japanese archipelago, the northern part of Vietnam, all and the southern part of eastern China. All of these areas that were really under the core influence, and those parts in yellow, which are part of the modern nation states in the region, but in many ways are late imperial add-ons and are not part of this historic region if we're thinking about the development of the culture and the philosophy and so on. And in fact, the expansion into these regions will be met with a certain degree of violence, a certain degree of cultural diffusion, and other questions about how do you organize societies where the majority is not, or at least the indigenous majority is not East Asian and playing according to the East Asian rules. So, as I mentioned, the center of Chinese civilization is in what's called the North China Plain. So, the North China Plain is an area that is incredibly dry but well irrigated. So, this creates the perfect area in order to grow significant amounts of food. And as you can see from the topographical map, this area is incredibly flat as well, which means that you can have large populations without the worry of mountains or other major structures dividing it. And there are two main rivers that run through China. There are other rivers that run in the other countries. And to the extent that they are important and relevant, we'll talk about those in those contexts. But in the very beginning, of course, China predates the other formations of civilization in this region by about 500 years, 500 to 1,000 years, depending on what your markers of civilization are. And most of that civilization is in what's called the Yellow River Valley. So we've got these two rivers in China. In the north, we have the Yellow River, and in the south, we have uh, the Yangtze, also known as the Changjiang in Chinese. The Yellow River is literally called Huanghe, or Yellow River in Chinese. And it's called this, as you can see from the picture, the water is incredibly brown and yellow. Um, and the reason for this is all of the silt, all of the nutrients that it's carrying from the Tibetan Plateau on its way to the East China Sea. And this water is incredibly nutritive, uh, plants and other material to grow, and that allowed this to be one of the four major centers of human development, right, alongside the Indus River, the Mesopotamia, and the Nile River in Egypt. Now, we also have to understand how rice and sedentarization really led to this creation of civilization. So, as we pointed out, uh, in order to have a large civilization, you needed a crop that would allow the creation of a large population. But it goes deeper than that. And we're going to talk about how East Asia creates some anomalies in what would normally be a relatively simplistic theory. So if we take our mind off of East Asia for a little bit and switch our lens to Southeast Asia, places like Burma, places like Thailand, they also grow rice. And archaeologists have argued that in the concept in the context of Southeast Asian civilizations, when you have a rice growing civilization, the power structure is what's called a mandala. And the way that this works was thus. You would have a seat of authority that would exist at, let's say, point X, and the amount of territory you could effectively control would be in 1 day's walk for a soldier from that point X in any direction, creating what's effectively a perfect circle, because more or less a soldier can walk the same distance in any direction. Now, of course, there are some caveats. If you're on a river, it'll stretch out along the river because you can sail usually faster than you can walk. And if brush is particularly dense, right? We're dealing with Southeast Asia where it's pretty much jungles everywhere. But if it's particularly dense, okay, maybe the soldier doesn't walk as far. So it might be a little bit more ovular. But by and large, you'll have these mandalas that are operating from the source of the center and are circular all the way around. And you can see sort of this mandala system as a theoretical grid in the upper left hand side, right, where you have 6 different mandalas and they overlap to certain degrees. And of course, where they overlap will be contests of power between these different groups. And this is how Southeast Asia primarily developed. And this is why Southeast Asia didn't really have unified states, with the exception of Vietnam, um, until roughly 1,000 years ago. There are two major distinctions here between the Southeast Asian system and what happened in China, despite them both being rice cultivation cultures. The movement of people was vastly different. If we remember, the Yellow River Delta Plain was a plain where it was roughly flat. And with Chinese domestication of horses, that meant that the area that a soldier could go was significantly larger than any of these mandala structures. And that made unification much more efficient. And when you had so many more territories under your control, it was much easier to prevent other groups from seceding or becoming independent. It's also the case that rice is a very intensive crop, which meant that you needed significant amounts of people to work. But those significant amounts of people could produce more food than themselves, which meant that you could have population increase. And so any of the areas that developed significantly enough could have the manpower to then use to create a state that would be more effective in maintaining those structures of production and those agents of conquest, right? You'd create more soldiers, you'd develop more technology for those soldiers. And so you have this development throughout the North China Plain that leads to the creation of major cities. And in fact, one of the earliest cities that we have in the archaeological record is what's called El Yito. You can see that recreation, and you can also notice that are already using a certain degree of imperial structure here. In the center, we have a large palace with incredibly sized buildings and promenades and area in areas that would be reserved for the king and his ministers. And of course, outside of that rectilinear structure, you have these small dots and houses that belong to the peasants who will control the rice fields um, out and around the territory. One of the interesting things with this increase in sedentary culture is that we see writing, but we see very little that transitions between the earliest forms of writing and a full formed ideographic or quasi ideographic system. And we can see elements of that ideographic system in its earliest incarnations in pottery carvings in Erlito, despite it being over 3,500 years old. Now, this story of rice cultivation, large empires managed by kings on with soldiers on horseback, is the dominant story in the North China Plain. And to a lesser extent, it becomes the story throughout the Red River Plain, which is the dominant center of North Vietnam, right, where the Vietnamese civilization is going to develop. It's similar to what we see in Korea around the Han River, which is the river that flows through Seoul. But in Japan, we have an interesting situation. Japan has some rivers, but none of them are as powerful as the Yellow River, um, respectively. And also, the geography of Japan is very mountainous, so very different from the situation in China, which is especially in the especially if we focus on the North China Plain, is relatively flat, as we saw. But Japan is over 70% mountains, which makes rice cultivation incredibly difficult. You have to create terraces, but still, the majority of the country is not farmable. So the rice production remained low. But the irony of ironies is that one of the most abundant fish producing regions is just off the coast of Honshu Island in Japan. This is the area near where Tokyo Yokohama is today, in Kanto region. And this created an interesting paradox. And let me work that through for you. So, as we mentioned, when you have a sedentary society and they're growing food, they're usually growing more food than they need to survive. And so, over time, they will replace, in terms of numbers, any other society that exists that's not sedentary, because those societies are constrained in their growth. So let's see why that is. So if you have a hunter-gatherer society, such as a fishing culture is, we don't think of it this way, but a fishing culture where they don't grow anything is a hunter-gatherer society. It just happens that the animals that they're gathering are fish in the water, as opposed to deer in the woods. But in the same way, the women are primarily collecting berries and other kinds of plant matter, and the men are gathering um, meat. In this case, the meat is fish. Sorry, they're hunting the fish. So in most hunter-gatherer societies, because of the limited amount of food that exists that is naturally growing, and the difficulty in capturing animals to eat, there is strong population control in hunter-gatherer societies to prevent themselves from starving themselves to death. So, if a hunter-gatherer society is placed next to a sedentary society, generally speaking, the sedentary society will overwhelm it numerically. That doesn't mean that they'll win all the wars and engagements. In fact, it's usually the opposite. Nomadic societies and hunter-gatherer societies tend to do better when it comes to warfare person for person than sedentary societies do. But in terms of sheer numbers, they get overwhelmed. But this is not the case in Japan because of the factors against large scale sedentary rice cultivation in Japan. And at the same time, the high amount of fish and shellfish that exist off the coast of Kanto region in Japan, the hunter gatherer societies and the sedentary societies were roughly at parity. And we can see this in the pottery between the Yayoi culture, which was a sedentary society, and the Jomon culture, which was a hunter-gatherer society, um, coexisting in Japan for centuries. It's believed that the current Yamato ethnicity, that is the dominant ethnicity of Japan, is mostly Yayoi, but that they intermarried with the Jomon and absorbed them over time. But this required the Yayoi to really develop a lot of other methods to increase the production of their agriculture, and it wasn't as immediate or as quick as we would see in other places. So we now get to one of the fundamental values in East Asia, and we're going to see how it plays out later in philosophy. But this is the value of harmony, and this runs straight into uh, contrast with the Western value of individualism. So, in the situation of harmony, you have a sense that the world is built with many differences, that the world is built in an uneven, asymmetric sort of way where people have different skills and abilities. There's no problem that people have different skills and abilities. The question is fitting the people in such a way that they create an aesthetic contrast integration, we can say. For example, if you have a garden, you would want flowers of many different colors throughout the garden to create the beauty that exists when you have multiple different colors of flowers. But that doesn't mean that those flowers shouldn't be arranged in a certain way to make those colors pop more, or that the flowers should be of differing heights, or that some of them should be withering while others are blooming. You should create something that looks harmonious between all the different aesthetic pieces. Of course, it's one thing to refer to the creation of a garden or flowers or other forms of life in this way, and it's another to refer to people in this way. But the philosophy in East Asia, centering on China, but throughout East Asia, is this sense of harmony and that every person in society has a role, has a place. They should not seek to change their place. They should not seek to do things that are against the will of the naturalistic roles into which they were set. And in fact, in many of the Chinese philosophical constructs, especially Taoism, and we'll get into why this is specifically Tao in a bit, um, there are naturalistic roles for every person in society. There's actually a very famous saying in China, the nail that sticks up will be hammered hardest, which sort of reinforces this idea that like a nail should be flush with the wood. It should be doing its purpose and not standing in the way. No person should be pushing outside of their boundaries because those societal boundaries and limitations, when taken all together in society, create something that is without friction, without problems, and can progress in peace and prosperity, right? That's this aesthetic contrast integration. The beauty of the garden is reflected in the functioning of the society. And so we have to understand that harmony is operating from this perspective. And the direction of this garden, the thing that makes it beautiful, is that there is a unity in that space. What's typically called centripetal unity, right? The unity that goes around the center of the circle. And of course, the center of that circle is the emperor or the king, depending on the time period, and his ministers as the first wave, and then uh, the businessmen and warriors and other people who are relatively skilled. Um, Businessmen, not merchants. There's a huge distinction there, but um, and then of course the peasants and the artisans as sort of a final ring. And in each case, they're holding their place in society around this center, always revolving around it, creating this peace and this harmony. And because of this, we have a society where it's more important to maintain the traditional order than it is to try and change it, to try and better it. Because if you try to better something that is already working, right, as a singular individual, you're going to pull this beautiful garden off kilter. And so the act of trying to change, the act of trying to innovate is seen as hubris in many cases, as opposed to in the West, where this act of trying to change is generally positively viewed as some kind of development or some kind of improvement on the process. And we're going to see how, again, especially with Taoism, you have this idea that any attempt at improving the system will only result in weakening the system. It won't actually create a material improvement. And because of the centrality of this system, focusing in on the palace and those who surround it, those people have the utmost duty and compulsion, and we'll see this more in Confucianism, to maintain the highest ethical standards to prevent um, everything that's rotating around them in that centripetal unity from falling off kilter. So the values held by the palace and by the ministers are essential for making sure that this harmony is maintained. So, from the Chinese perspective, this is not some blank check given to authority figures in order to run a society according to their will, but is in actuality uh, something that places a huge burden on the centers of authority because their only ability to maintain legitimacy is through the creation of this harmony that they sit at the center of. So, because we've developed this system of harmony that exists within Chinese society per se, we then see the expansion of this system to other countries. When the other countries develop, like the ancestors of Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and so on, and all the nomadic tribes that are outside of, let's say, the Red Belt, you begin to see this idea that the harmony should expand to them too. They should be part of this system. They should also be revolving around, and of course, at this time, China is an empire, it's no longer kingdoms. They should all be revolving around the empire and the emperor himself. And so you create this system where China is the middle kingdom, Zhongguo, the center of this unity that is existing throughout the world. And as the cultural and meaning juggernaut that it is, all the other countries are to be vassals or in a state of quasi submission to this middle kingdom. So that way they are too part of the harmony and prosperity that exists. Now, the extent to which that system existed um, in terms of the recognition that it had by non-Chinese varied tremendously depending on what part of the harmonic sphere, if you want to call it, these groups sat in. On one extreme end, you have the Koreans. Now, the Chinese um, never tried to conquer Korea, with one or two small exceptions. By and large, they considered the Koreans to be extrinsic to the Middle Kingdom. They were going to be a vassal state. But that vassalage was very open. There were a few requirements, such as that the Korean king could never call himself an emperor, right? Because that would be competing with the title of emperor in China. And that anytime a king was crowned, there had to be a ministry official from China who approved of that person becoming king. There's never a case that I'm aware of where China refused to permit this person to become king, but China wanted to have the say so. In many ways, you can consider it the way that the King of England, for example, has viceroys, like the Governor General in Canada, who approves the prime minister when the prime minister is chosen. Um, So in this way, China maintained a vassalage of Korea, but it was a relationship that served both sides very well. And the Chinese-Korean alliance was something that survived pretty much until the end of the 19th century. On the flip side, you had groups like the Vietnamese. Now, the Vietnamese um, were individuals that China considered to be part of the Middle Kingdom. They never saw them as a distinct or separate entity. They saw them as the Baiyue or the Yuenan, meaning the southern Yuenan, meaning southern Yue or southern moon people, and um, Baiyue, meaning the hundred moon people. But they never saw them as a distinct ethnic group that had the right of self-determination in the way that they sort of understood that for Koreans. And so you have, from the Chinese perspective, numerous rebellions by the Vietnamese to expel Chinese rulers, and you had numerous Chinese returns of sovereignty over Vietnam. Each one would last a few centuries in one direction or the other. One of the more famous of these rebellions is by the Chung sisters, which you can see a picture of in the upper right hand side. Now, of course, from the Vietnamese perspective, rebellions like those of the Chung sisters were nationalist exercises in Vietnamese self determination from an occupying oppressive country. And so, as we go through the history and we see the relationship between China and Vietnam, it's the exact opposite of the vassalage that China and Korea have, where Korea is a doting and accepting vassal, a strong ally. Vietnam and China have this continual relationship of violence and disagreement over the southern border of China and what would be independent of China. Most other countries existed somewhere in between these extremes. We could take, for example, the Mongols and their relationship with um, the Chinese states depended incredibly on power structures in their part of the world and power structures in China. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Relations with Japan were often difficult. In fact, the Chinese would call those in Japan, even though they were somehow in this harmonic sphere, almost barbarian. And of course, anybody who was outside of the sphere, like those in the yellow areas, those people were barbarians. And the Chinese had a very strong derisive view of those outside of the harmonic sphere because those outside of the harmonic sphere were not living the best life and they were not cultured, they were not thoughtful, and they did not possess the virtues that were the center of that harmonic sphere. This, of course, runs straight into conflict with the Western conception of individual nations and independence. This is a this is a notion that's called the Westphalian nation state because it is in the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 that this conception was really developed. This idea that no country, despite how big or how small it is, has the rights of self-determination and the right to its own peaceful relationships on par with every other state. The Chinese harmonic system, where they were the middle kingdom and the center of civilization, is at direct odds with this Westphalian system because the center of civilizations means that only China has the ability to dictate the relationships between independent states because those states aren't truly independent. They're all part of this one singular unit. It would be like saying that the different planets in the solar system could negotiate their own orbits as opposed to all orbiting the sun. And so as you can imagine, when the 19th century happens, it's a massive collision between how the Chinese and those who are loyal to the Chinese harmonic system, the center of civilization, see their world and how Westerners see China and the other places in the East. Part of how those other peoples demonstrate their loyalty to China is through the giving of tribute. And we'll talk more about how trade is, in many cases, an act of respect more than it is an economic act. And that sort of flows into this center of civilizations where China would receive gifts from the other provinces and China would give gifts back. In fact, the gifts that China gave back were usually more lucrative than the gifts that they received, because, of course, as the big brother nation, as the center of the world, they were the ones who had the wealth and prosperity to give to the others and to maintain the system. And that was part of the values that underlined good rulership, was respecting all of those to whom you are sovereign. One last piece of this that is often not talked about or is often glossed over is the idea that China itself went through periods of union and division throughout its history. And in fact, if you count the years over the last 2,000 years of Chinese history, there have been more times in history that there have been more than one Chinese state, even excluding the current China-Taiwan fighting since 1949. That there have been multiple Chinese states in the mainland of China, then there have been a united state over all of China, or most of China. Um, and so this idea of a unitary harmonic state becomes an ideal that becomes imposed on reality, more so than necessarily the historically accurate method by which this government functioned. And of course, people are fallible and situations changed, and not every ruler was the Confucian ideal of virtue, and not every person lived, you know, completely passive Tao life. There are a number of comments, but none of them are really questions, so I'll address those when we get to the end of the presentation. So we then have this idea, right? If China has been expanding and unified and divided and reunified, what does that mean for being Chinese? So if you look at population estimates of China, depending on which estimate you read, between 92 and 98%, I think 98% is probably closer, of the Chinese population identifies as Han, which is the ethnic term that refers to people that we would consider in the West as Chinese. But the underlying supposition in the West that we have with regards to ethnicity is that ethnicity is the marker of some kind of fictive kinship or even plausibly real kinship. That the people who identify with a certain ethnic title share family, and they are family. It might be, 15, 17, 30 generations back, but they all share ancestors and they all speak the same language and they all have the same origin. It's in the same way that, for example, a person with the last name Tucker who lives in Minnesota and a person with the last name Tucker who lives in Ipswich, England, and a person with the last name Tucker who lives in Sydney, Australia, might well be related to each other, 17 generations back, right? They're all descendants from England. They just happen to spread out to different areas. And so you could come to the supposition that there was this initial Han population that existed in the North China Plain, and that Chinese population um, just overran everywhere. And because they overran everywhere, the population throughout China is Han, and that is the end of the story. Genetics don't seem to agree with this. Now, there is less genetic differentiation within the Han ethnicity than we would see between other ethnic groups with less commingling, like, for example, Germans and Russians. Um, so, but at the same time, we can actually look at people's genetics as Hans and tell roughly which region of China they come from, which should give us a sense that Han is much less an ethnic title in the sense of this unifying fictive kinship, and more in the sense of a racial group like we would see in the United States, like white or black, where people come from very diverse origins, but because they all look similar, they all act similar, they all ascribe to a certain historical narrative that defines them, um, they are Han. Or in the case of the United States, they are white or black, right? Now, of course, there is some physical aspect to it. If somebody looks like I do, and I say that I'm Han, I think that people will disagree with me on that. But within China, the physical differences between people are not significant enough to cause that kind of rupture. And in fact, the differences in many cases between people who are ethnic Han and who are of the minorities, and China has something like 50 to 56, depending on how you count them, ethnic minorities. The government recognizes around 54. Those people don't, for the most part, there are some exceptions like the Uyghurs or the Tibetans. Um, they don't look that different from Chinese. And in fact, in many cases, there's very little difference between, let's say, if we look at that small island off the south coast of Japan, which is the island of Hainan, there are the Li and the Yue Hans. The difference physically between the Li people and the Yue Hans is barely noticeable. In fact, many Yue Hans are probably Li also, who just became Chinese. So similar to the becoming white or the becoming black in an American context, becoming Chinese was through affiliation and through the acceptance of this culture. If we go back to the idea of harmony, right? You're taking on these particular aspects, you're behaving in this certain way, you're becoming part of this harmonic circle. You are Han. And in fact, the name Han comes from the first dynasty that really united China for a significant period of time. So, in that way, they're identifying themselves with the empire that created them. And there are many cultural signifiers of being Han. There are things like following Chinese religions. There are things like writing in Chinese calligraphy. There are things like eating uh, foods in Chinese ways and eating the Chinese foods. One thing that, for example, people often don't notice is, for example, that in Thailand, people don't use chopsticks, right? Chopsticks are an East Asian phenomenon. But the ancestors of the Thai people also lived in what is southern China. In fact, if you look at this map, you can see towards the border with Vietnam, there's a group called Zhuang, Chuang, and the Zhuang are distant relatives of the Thai who did not leave southern China, right? When the remainder of the Thai people moved further south into what is now Thailand. So these changes, these developments, these cultural markers, right? Because becoming part of China was to unbarbarian yourself, was to take on the aspects of civilization. These people Hanified, these people Sinicized, that's the correct term for it. These people Sinicized and therefore became Chinese. And in many respects, a lot of what we see today in modern China in terms of its treatment of minorities reflects this pressure towards Sinicization and civilization, civilizing the non-Chinese. For groups like the Zhuang, for example, that act in a very Chinese way, those repercussions are minimal. For other groups that are more resistant to the process of Sinicization, the resulting actions are more severe. So, as I mentioned, the Zhuang and other groups that existed in South China were pushed out in many respects from South China, in whole or in part, depending on the group. And we can see some of the remnants of this if you look at the linguistic map in the upper right-hand side, where you have a lot of different non-Chinese languages existing in the south of China. Now, the reason that these areas are as dots, almost like islands in a sea of Chinese speakers, is because they are the exact opposite. Those are mountains. Southern China, as opposed to northern China, is much more mountainous with large valleys that are capable of large scale rice agriculture. But by and large, um, the southern part of China faces the ocean and gains much of its wealth through trade. That's why Hong Kong is in the south of China. That's why Shenzhen is in the south of China. Many of these trading cities, Guangzhou, that existed facing the sea because they would bring in their food through trade. But those mountains provided an ideal place for those people who did not want to Sinicize, those people who did not want to embrace Chinese culture and become Chinese. So when the Qin dynasty, for example, and we'll talk about them next time we meet, hopefully, expanded against these populations in southern China, seeking to Sinicize them, many of those populations fled further into Southeast Asia, where they became uh, civilizations in their own right. The Thai were, of course, one of them. We also have the Hmong. The Mon Miao are a linguistic group that are related to the Hmong, Hmong, minority that's quite famous for straddling the border between Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. Also among the people that migrated further south are Kin, right? The population that makes up Vietnam. You have people that are related to certain Burmese minorities. And so all of these populations moved into uh, Southeast Asia, where because they were agricultural and the populations in Southeast Asia were still hunter-gatherer, they largely replaced those populations, which would have looked more like Indians from India, with these populations from southern China. But there was one other aspect to the Qin expansions. It wasn't just that significant numbers of indigenous people fled further south, that minorities of them stayed but fled into the mountains where they couldn't be Sinicized, but that some of them did stay where they lived. And furthermore, many criminals were sent from the Qin prisons as settlers to this region in order to Hanify it and to make it more culturally unified with the northern China plain. And we're going to see that same sort of thing occurring in other areas that are part of this larger harmonic sphere. One of those examples is Vietnam. When, as I mentioned, Vietnam was expanding further and further south throughout the last millennium. In particular, they went into direct conflict with the Chams in the late 1400s, culminating with the siege of Vijaya. This is actually the ruins of the city of Vijaya, which was a Cham city. The king put it under siege for 10 months before finally breaking the siege, and putting the Cham under Vietnamese occupation. But it wasn't just that the Vietnamese wanted the Cham's land, they also began sending Vietnamese peasants there in order to build up a kin presence in in the Cham territories, and also as the kin expanded further south, even past Cham territory into territory that had a lot of Khmer and other populations. They also imported populations that they felt would better align with them, such as Chinese expatriates, because they felt that the Chinese expatriates would require Vietnamese support and therefore would not be aligned with indigenous interests. So you have that kind of expansion in Vietnam. In Japan, you can see the picture in the lower right-hand side of the samurai in the Ainu in the late 18th century, as Japan was becoming more and more able to control the Ainu, they sent more and more samurai there to suppress rebellions on the island and unify the territory under direct control of the Tokugawa shogunate, which was the Japanese government that existed at that time. And as I said, by the beginning of the 19th century, you have direct Japanese colonization and settlement of Hokkaido, aside from those small peninsulas where they had made inroads before as traveling merchants. And so the last one that I want to bring up is the island of Taiwan, where the first colonizers of the island were actually Europeans, particularly the Portuguese and the Dutch. The Dutch held out the longest, but they were expelled by the Chinese. Now, we should bear in mind that the Chinese who expelled them were not indigenous to Taiwan. The Dutch had actually imported them as laborers, and they felt that the Chinese were much more effective than the indigenous population of Taiwan, which are what are called Austronesians. They're more ethnically similar to Filipinos than they are to Chinese. Um, and so those Chinese revolted, and those Chinese had assistance from the Ming Empire of China at that time, which led to the capture of Fort Zeelandia, which was the last Dutch fort on the island of Taiwan, and brought Taiwan under Chinese occupation. Instead of so first it was ruled mostly by indigenous people, then partially ruled by European colonizers, then a slow expanding Chinese territory. Then they fought for independence when China had political changes from the Ming to the Qing, and then eventually the Qing Empire, after around 100 years, was able to conquer Taiwan and bring it under its control. So you have numerous different occupying powers controlling Taiwan. In fact, the government of Taiwan today is almost all ethnically Han. The Aboriginals are not really represented in the Taiwanese government. And it's the same way that the Chams are minimally represented in control of South Central Vietnam, and that the uh, Ainu practically have ceased to exist within the context of Japan. There are very few full-blooded Ainu left, never mind representation. And so, and within China, minorities, as I said, make up 5 or less percent of the total population. So in many cases, these minorities have been so absorbed by their conquering population in terms of culture, in terms of identity, in terms of everything else, that they simply cease to exist or are numerically replaced. All right, a few more notes. So we start moving into the barbarians, right? And China's relationship with the barbarians, uh, sorry, becomes a very difficult subject to talk about because of how often and changing the barbarians were. We have very few sources from the barbarians themselves. There's the secret history of the Mongols, but by and large, what we know of them is what the Chinese said of them, especially uh, when it comes to truthfulness. A lot of these sources are biased by the writers who put them together. Um, One of those was Sima Qian. And Sima Qian is unique in that because he was forthright to the king he served, sorry, the emperor he served, he was castrated um, because he didn't give the testimony that the king would like. Um, Given that fortitude, generally people are more inclined to accept his version. And in fact, he cites numerous cases where the Chinese government was unable to tame the barbarians. The barbarians, despite being few in number, were actually quite effective in raiding Chinese territory. And so you had this exchange of gifts between the barbarians and the Chinese. Often the rate of exchange would depend highly on whether or not the barbarians were unified and therefore posed a significant threat to China, or whether they were disunited and therefore did not. But by and large, they were much more effective warriors. They had better command of horses, and they had much better defenses. This led to what would eventually be the construction of the Great Wall in order to protect the northern part of China. Now, there's a comment here that talks about the rice growing and points out that it was much more popular in southern China. That is true. In the north of China, there was also a lot of wheat cultivation. In fact, wheat cultivation took priority, but similar to rice, if you want to cultivate anything, you need to be able and maintain power over it. You need to be able to exercise military control. And so the distinction that I was bringing up in regards to the mandala system in Southeast Asia really comes to the fore with the ability to expand power, not just concentrate. Um, there's another point here that Yue um, was Chinese terminology for a number of different tribes. And I agree, the Chinese were not terribly concerned, just as they weren't with the term barbarian, as to exactly who these people were. Um, but the Vietnamese see their ancestry from this, and they both use that term. Um, not So it's not exactly an ethnic name, but it's sort of an ethnic category, like Hispanic would be. Um, all of the relations with the barbarians, though, occurred within the context of the Li, or the ritual tradition that existed in China. And therefore, it was seen as an expression of that relationship, the gift giving, the relationships. And gifts could be varied. It could be things as simple as gold, or it could be more expansive. It could be brides, it could be slaves, anything under the sun could be exchanged as gifts. And in many cases, what you ended up having was, uh, and in many cases, the exchanges that ended up occurring, Sorry, I lost my. Yeah. So um, these exchanges occurred within that Chinese paradigm. So um, this led to certain tribes that the Chinese felt were more in line with them and their civilization, even if they couldn't be civilized, they couldn't be Sinicized, but they could form an effective border. Um, and these barbarians were called cooked barbarians in the sense of, unlike things that were raw, because there's a strong aversion in Chinese society to eating that which is raw, that's uncivilized to do. You cook your food before you eat it. So a raw barbarian is an uncivilized barbarian that exists beyond the fringes, does not accept the Chinese order in any way, and is a real threat to the harmonic civilization continuing. So you then have this idea that, okay, if you have cooked barbarians, barbarians that accept certain aspects of Chinese governance, they are willing to give gifts, but they won't pay taxes. They won't invade the Chinese state as long as we give them those gifts, and in fact, we can use them as weapons, as a first shield against the other barbarians. So what ends up happening is that in eras of prosperity, you have almost this uh, set of cooked barbarians that separates China from the raw barbarians. And in other cases, when the raw barbarians, for want of a better term, are able to provide better gifts to these cooked barbarians, you have the large scale infiltrations from the north. Things like the Mongols expanding are exactly when these flips happen. Now, of course, in keeping with this idea of the barbarians being identifiable groups, writers like Sima Qian argue that there was this great chasm between the Huaxia, the the Chinese center, and the different regions, the Beiji, the Xirong, the Nanman, and Dongyi, uh, that represent the different areas in which the barbarians could sit, and that there was no relationship that could be forged between these two people, that there was no intermarrying or mixing, that the barbarians were clearly barbarian, that the Chinese were clearly Chinese. But of course, in reality, we know that this is not the case. There was a point made, and I'll expand on it more in the Q&A section. But the relationship between the Chinese government and the cooked barbarians can actually be seen as very similar to the relationship between the Roman Empire and the Foederati, which were the Germanic tribes that could be brought into the Roman sphere and therefore were seen as able to fill in where legionnaires could not and protect Roman society from the Alemanni, the or other Germanic tribes that were resistant to Roman entreaties. Another key aspect of Chinese relations is the idea that everything exists within China. So in the West, there's this strong impulse towards trade and this desire for trade from an economic perspective, that the world is better because we're able to bring goods from location A to location B and create a unified economic system based on merchantry. And the Chinese system was vehemently not that. The Chinese felt that they had everything they needed. In fact, there's a famous letter that Qianlong wrote to King George III of England in 1793. So, for those of you keeping track, that's about 10 years after they had signed the Treaty of Paris that gave the United States independence. So, the British were knocking on China's door and they were asking for permission to purchase tea and silk and to trade for these items within the context of China. And the emperor's reply was, our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. Notice that it's not that the English didn't have anything to trade with China the Chinese couldn't produce. All of English weapons, modern quasi-industrial developments, um, all of these technologies were more advanced than what China possessed at the time. But from the perspective of China, there was nothing to be gained through these innovations, right? First of all, they would throw off the harmony because they would have to be integrated somehow. But on a second, more important level, is that trade is not the engine for improving people's lives. Improving people's lives comes through the cultivation of virtue and the improvement of value. So these things coming in and perhaps creating wealth or not is not the method of is not what's being sought. And so the fact that the English wanted Chinese goods, and by the way, he goes on further in the letter to say, we know that you want our silk and our tea, and we're more than happy to trade it with you. We just want nothing that you have. So they just accepted gold in return. Um, but at a fundamental level, trade was never about acquiring resources you didn't have, improving your economic position. The economy was simply not something that they connected to external relationships. And to really bring home the point of them seeing trade often as a sign of respect, that different parties would bring tribute to the emperor, and the emperor would send tribute back to those parties, to demonstrate the connection and the relationship between those states. I wanted to show you the boat of Zheng He, who was uh, often mislabeled as an explorer. He certainly did explore, but he went mostly to places that the Chinese already knew about. And he went with these massive treasure boats. You can see them in comparison to the Santa Maria, the largest of Christopher Columbus's ships. And you can see just how much more massive these ships were, despite um, Zheng He living nearly 70 years before Christopher Columbus sailed. And these ships were loaded with gifts. That was the point of them. They went to between 9 and 13 different destinations and would offload gifts of the Chinese Empire to populations in Africa or India, um, Southeast Asia, in order to promote the relationship between those states and the Ming Empire that he represented. At no point was there an attempt to claim land or to acquire resources or make demands of any kind from these populations, other than that they accept that they were in relationship to the master under heaven, right? The emperor of the Ming dynasty, who would do nothing to them, right? Because they were far too far away for him to really trouble himself with, you know, dealing with them militarily, never mind the fact that they had literally just beat out the Mongols a few decades earlier. But it was simply a show of friendship and respect that they were giving out all these gifts. It had no economic weight or political weight beyond those relationships. And it goes back to the high context culture piece and the harmony piece that we addressed earlier. So we now have what I can call the five religions of China. And one of the interesting, there are a few interesting things about the five religions before we dig a little bit more deeply into them. The first element is that unlike Western religions, where the religions are exclusive and give advice on all aspects of life, Chinese religions are inclusive of each other, and they don't necessarily give information on all aspects of life. And I'll talk about that in a second. The other one is that these religions, philosophies, ideologies, however you want to construe them, don't necessarily have a divine or need a divine in order to function. So, especially Confucianism and legalism say almost nothing about the supernatural, even though Confucius himself would occasionally talk about demons or spirits. There's never any sense about what that heavenly plane looks like or acts like in those philosophies. And so There are debates as to whether these are strictly political philosophies or philosophy or just general philosophies, or whether or not they can be called religions because they don't have that spiritual component. But back to the first point, which is that different religions in China have different relationships to which they apply, and therefore a person can say that they are an adherent of all five of these religions simultaneously because they've grafted the different important aspects of each into a larger whole. So, what are these different religions? The first ones are what are called the folk religions, and the official name of the folk religion tends to be different in different parts of the East Asian world. In China, it tends to be called Shunism, referring to the Shunxian or the gods. In Korea, it tends to be called Mugyo. In Japan, it tends to be called Shintoism. In Vietnam, it tends to be called Dao Long. Um, but the aspects of it are roughly the same in all of these cases. And this also overlaps to a large degree with ancestor worship. And so the thing that the folk religion generally tends to give people in East Asia is their sense of pantheon. Who are the gods and goddesses? What do they want? How do they operate in the world or not operate in the world? What kind of attributes do they have? What is their relationship to one another? How do the ancestors interact with them? How do they communicate with spirits? That's what these folk religions tend to answer. You then have Confucianism, which is a set of philosophies and relationships. Um, One of the things Confucius is very famous for is this concept called the rectification of names, which is that everything should be called by its proper name so it can be sat in the proper place in the hierarchy. And once things are in the proper place in the hierarchy, that will create that aesthetic, um, that aesthetic harmonic system because everything will be in the proper order. And he spends a significant part of his time talking about cardinal relationships between different parties, and we'll go in more in depth about that, in order to create this hierarchy on a personal level. And so Confucianism tends to really focus in terms of its place in people's spirituality as governmental ritual. How are government ministers supposed to act? What is the relationship between a government minister and the population? What is the relationship between people in their own self-government, right? Their homes. What's the relationship between the father and the son, and so on? Um, Confucianism lays out how these relationships are supposed to work and the rituals that people are supposed to perform in order to sacralize those relationships. Taoism tends to be the faith of understanding the way the world works and trying to do what the world expects, to follow what is called the Tao, or the way that the world is. And by doing that and not deviating from it, this principle of Wu Wei, which we will discuss in a bit, a person can achieve inner peace. And this is why Taoism tends to be in people's reflections of personal spirituality. How does a person find inner peace? How does a person know what their place is in the world? How does a person relate to other people and see themselves in the wider harmony of society? Those questions are Tao questions. Then you have Buddhism. And the Buddhism of East Asia is very different from the Buddhism of South Asia and of Southeast Asia. The primary aspect of Buddhism of South Asia is what's called dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness. It's often translated as suffering, but suffering implies a strong negative to it. Unsatisfactoriness is better in that it is disfavorable, but not painful necessarily. And that people always seek to gain more. And in doing so, they can never satiate the hunger that they have because if a person, you know, has such drive that they get themselves 10 luxury cars. The thing that they want is the 11th luxury car. They can't be satiated with that. And Buddhism in South Asia is the recognition of that unsatisfactoriness and therefore the detachment from that pursuit in order to find internal peace. And so Buddhism has a number of rituals that are associated, especially in South Asia, with the detachment from material concerns and the appreciation of what exists in reality as being ultimately meaningless when it comes to the expression of the soul and the attainment of virtue. And so, because Buddhism has all these rituals, the way that it tends to impact Chinese lives is through the personal actions that a person should do or their praxis. What kind of practices does a person do? When should they meditate? When should they go to the temple? How should they seek a priest? What kind of uh, yeah, what holidays tend to be folk religion as well, but there are Buddhist holidays as well. Um, and what do you do on certain holidays and how do you do it? Again, part of it is folk religion, part of it is Buddhism. But you have this sort of set of activities that Buddhism can give you a roadmap to do, while really not dealing with any of the other components. And finally, legalism um, results in it's really more of a political philosophy, and it's about how you can create an effective governing apparatus through the centralization of the state, and the state continues to expand and enrich itself. Um, the belief in the state's right to do that and the belief in the validity of that centralization. And that is the fundamental way that it affects Chinese today, and has affected Chinese throughout history, is this idea of a highly centralized state being almost divinely inspired. Now, it may be difficult to imagine how all of these different pieces can fit together without necessarily contradicting each other. And I'll give you one example, right? Buddhism as a religion um, has very little to say about the gods or goddesses. The Buddha himself is what I would call an apatheist, meaning that in contrast to the theists, atheists, and agnostics in Western society, who all care about whether a God exists, they either know that he does exist, they claim to know that he exists, they claim to know that he doesn't exist, or they claim that they don't know. They all claim that the question matters, right? If God existed for any one of those three groups and they found out about it, it would change their life in material ways. They would start doing things that they hadn't been doing otherwise. For the apatheist, it actually doesn't matter. If you told an apatheist that a God existed or had definitive proof that could convince them that a God didn't exist, um, their lives wouldn't change. And the Buddha spoke on this question, saying that the unsatisfactoriness of life will not be resolved by the gods. If they exist, if they don't exist, they seem disinterested in helping us to escape the unsatisfactoriness of life. So whether or not we believe in them or don't believe in them as a choice, um, really has nothing to do with our pursuit of enlightenment. And so Buddhism generally hasn't had a spiritual character of gods and demons and so on that is all its own. Buddhists today absolutely do believe in those things, but to the extent that they do, they almost always come from the pre-existing culture that existed where the Buddhism went. In Southeast Asia, for example, the legends of the Naga and the Garuda, which are key to the identities of Thai and Cambodian Theravada Buddhists, existed in pre-Buddhist um, society, be it when those areas were Hindu majority or when those areas were animist majority. And when, therefore, the Buddhists came to China, all of the pantheon that existed in the Shinist folk religion could easily mesh with this perspective from Buddhism, just as Buddhism was able to incorporate the gods of Southeast Asia. Buddhism was able to accommodate the gods of China. And so you can sort of have this situation where the Buddhists don't really care whether or not gods exist, but we have an answer. Gods exist. These are them. And that answer comes from the Shinists. And the interesting part about the answer from the Shinists is even though they will say that the God exists, you have the great Jade Emperor, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and his heavenly court. At the end of the day, the gods in Shunism don't care about human life in any meaningful way. So at the end of the day, the Buddhists being apathetic works because the gods of the Shinists won't do anything. And so you have this sort of feeding into each other on just this one question. And you can imagine if I extrapolate this to all the other questions, right? We saw that Confucianism and Taoism both speak to different aspects of harmony. Taoism speaks to the aspect of maintaining your station, Confucianism speaks to the aspect of achieving high value and understanding hierarchical relationships. And so, as these pieces fit together, they create a unified set of beliefs that a Chinese person can ascribe to while following all five religions. All right. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the folk religions. So in the center panel, you can actually see this is from uh, the Qing dynasty, so it's relatively recently created, but this is actually the heavenly court of the Jade Emperor, the Yu Huang. Um, and the Jade Emperor was considered the heavenly ruler, and of course, just like on Earth, where the ruler was the center of the world. The emperor was the center of the world, and then around him were his courtiers, and around those courtiers were the population, and so on and so forth. The heavenly realm looked the same way. You had the heavenly court with the various ministers of that court, most of whom were incompetent, just like in reality. And you have the demons, of course. The demons, as you can see from the picture of the Japanese guardian demon, um, are the term is usually a term for any kind of non-human celestial or quasi-celestial entity. Um, so most of these demons are either positive or neutral, not necessarily, most of them are not necessarily evil, which is why they protect temples and similar. Um, those demons also exist in heaven. They also exist on earth. Probably one of the most famous of these kinds of demons was the Monkey King, right? Lived in the who lived in heaven and tried to get a sacred peach from the peach garden. A lot of the stories of what happens in Chinese heaven, for want of a better term, are stories that seem very earth-like because in many ways the Shinist teachings about heaven were designed to explain the failures and incompleteness of the world as it existed. And those who expounded on Shinist philosophy, like those who wrote the epics like Journey to the West, were writing about, in a tongue in cheek way, their criticisms of the empire. If we go back to this indirect speech, in many ways, these writings were their own critiques of how governments were ignoring the people's needs and unable to avail themselves of the virtue that they so needed in order to create true harmony. There's a question of what's the importance of jade. Jade was considered a very valuable and beautiful material, and therefore the emperor would wear jade as a symbol of his power. But remember, this is the heavenly emperor. The earthly emperor did not wear jade, he wore silk. One of the aspects of folk religion that people um, often forget is that folk religion tends to be much more egalitarian in terms of its priestly class than do the other religions of East Asia um, because of its roots and its connections to shamanism, where in shamanic tradition, women tend to have more spiritual access than men, and therefore they demonstrate those by performing numerous kinds of arts. One in, and so because of the way these folk religions have survived, in many cases, we have women who still perform many of the rites that are appropriate, even though, in contrast to purely shamanic faiths, those who without direct influence from an organized religion, um, women tend to be the dominant priestesses and organizers, things like the Druids, Asatru, um, the religion of the Sami, uh, indigenous religions of the Mongolians, and so on. But in this case, for example, we can see a Mudang, who is a Korean priestess of the Mogyo faith, which is the folk religion of Korea. And she's performing what's called kut, which is a set of dances and ceremonies designed to entertain the spirits and to entertain the heavenly court. And that way, the heavenly court will support the people that are surrounding her. A lot of these sorts of rituals and actions are very predicated on the seasons and on the history of the people that surround them, and the calendars become a very important focal point for those in folk religions, believing that there will be auspicious days and inauspicious days. Uh, a type of horoscope to follow about different kinds of events. And in order to assuage negative oncoming problems, entreaties should be made to the gods in order to reverse those. You also have incorporated into folk religion the worship of the ancestors, especially ancestors of a particular family or a clan, or in many cases, of venerable rulers, rulers who are believed to have achieved virtue in their lives. In the afterlife, they would be in the court of the Jade Emperor and therefore able to petition on behalf of the living. So you can see, for example, the Tran Nhan Tong um, uh, temple in Vietnam, in the city of Hue. Now, of course, this is a new temple. It was built very recently, but it recognizes an emperor who existed about 600 years ago, 500, 600 years ago, in Vietnam, and is visited by people specifically to worship and ask for the protection of this former emperor as he sits in the court of the Jade Emperor. Sorry, this former king, as he sits in the court of the Jade Emperor, in order to talk to him and ask for his beneficence on behalf of the people. And finally, the last two things I wanted to bring up about folk religions. In the Shinto religion, there's a directionality to the entry of the spirits, and you can help the spirits to enter our realm and connect to us through the construction of tori or gate. And these gates can be found all throughout Japan, especially in Shinto shrines, in order to concentrate the spiritual energy and to bring people closer in connection to the divine. And the Japanese pantheon of goddesses like Amaterasu and similar. And the final thing is that, as we mentioned, this tradition has a strong affiliation with calendars and organization and astrology and similar elements like that. You also have a representation of mythological creatures that connect to the different elements of the world and the different seasons. For example, you have uh, the black turtle, as you can see in the lower left-hand side, which represents renewal, in that turtles are continually adaptable. They live a very long time. And of course, it imbibes both the elements of water and earth, being that it is something that moves between the water and the earth. You have the dragon, the Qinglong, um, the blue dragon, which is uh, an element of royalty and majesty. The dragon has often been the symbol of regality in East Asia. And so these sorts of connections between divine beasts and living people, and the elements that they represent, gives a fundamental foundation um, to understanding the physicality of the world through this divine prism. It's worth also pointing out, related to this, is where feng shui and other sorts of ideas come from, about the positioning of physical items, because those materials might be made of wood, or made of earth, or made of water, or made of metal, or made of fire. Those five elements together being the elements that effectively serve as a basis in Shinist ideology, Shinist religion, um, to explain the world as it exists and how the different gods have moved through it. So we then get to Confucianism. Now we have to understand a little bit about the history of China in order to understand where Confucianism comes from. So we spoke about Chinese history. We talked about the city of Erlito, and um, that state, that city was part of the Xia dynasty. It's debated, but it would be contemporaneously in terms of time with the records written much later about the Xia dynasty. The Xia dynasty was replaced by the Shang, and the Shang by the Zhou, such that by around the year, um, let's say 1000 BCE, the Zhou state was a relatively powerful state that controlled significant parts of the North China plain and had expanded into parts of southern China as well. But in 770, there was a massive collapse of the Zhou state. And that collapse occurred as more and more of the ministers dispatched to the different provinces began to take more and more power for themselves, breaking away from this larger empire and controlling their own fiefdom with greater and greater autonomy, until such point as you had something like 250 states existing throughout China. And you can see, for example, this map from 689 BC, when the remains of the Zhou Empire were still very divided between different entities, that there were numerous of them in various sizes throughout China. And this period of disorder was what led to a number of philosophical uh, questions about what does it mean to create a meaningful state and how is this supposed to be done? So you had Kongzi, also known in English as Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BCE, and he wanted to be a member of the bureaucracy in his home state of Lu. Um, he tried, and he actually got a position, a relatively junior position, serving Duke Ding. The Duke was, of course, an English translation of his Chinese title. In many cases, these groups did not call themselves kings because to claim the title of king would be to claim much more power than they had. But Confucius felt that Duke Ding didn't take his affairs of state very seriously and spent a significantly greater time with his concubines than he did mastering the art of statecraft. That and the fact that he wasn't promoted to a higher point in Ding's administration led him to retire. And eventually, in his retirement, he became a teacher and went around Lu and several other states. In fact, much of the time that he was a teacher, he was actually in exile from Lu, self-imposed. And his students began to collect the teachings of his in a book called the Analects. And those Analects serve as the basis of Confucianism today. Um, there are numerous different ways that the values of the Analects are brought forward, but usually it's in the form of a dialectic. One such case is the one above, where Zigong asked Confucius, "Is there any one word that could guide a person throughout his life?" And the master, Confucius, replied, "How about reciprocity? Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself." Now, of course, he said it about 500 years before Jesus did, but this is not a new sentiment. It existed in other texts before that point as well. But it sort of shows the way that Confucius would point out different moral beliefs and moral ideas in the cultivation of virtue. So, Confucianism is based on five fundamental ideas that his followers sort of pulled together from the Analects, especially Mengzi or Mencius in English. And I'm going to sort of see Confucius and Mencius as sort of a unified philosophical piece. Of course, There are numerous distinctions between their philosophy and the philosophy of the Confucianists. And I would encourage you to watch Jason's presentations on philosophy to understand more about the distinctions there and the real development of Confucian ideology. But the first 2 points of integrity and wisdom are sort of self-explanatory, so we don't really need to go into depth there. The ones that we will talk about are the benevolence, run, the ethical behavior, yi, and ritual behaviors and etiquette, li. So when it comes to benevolence, there's this idea that a person in a superior relationship has a duty to respect and to treat well those under him, and that a person in the inferior position of a relationship deserves greater love than the person who is inferior, right? So the person above should be a protector, and the person below should be an admirer. And so, of course, the greatest leader of the emperor deserves the greatest amount of love and the greatest amount of respect. And of course, the emperor's duty is to take care of the citizens of and the subjects of his country. And so a virtuous leader could be identified through his actions towards the population, things like lightening penalties, uh, inflicting fewer punishments, reducing taxes. And since China didn't really have a slave system, it had some slaves, but it was never as organized as in other places. But less corvée labor, where free people are press gang to do work, but they aren't formally enslaved. And so you would do less of that. And so a virtuous ruler would be identified by the way he treated the population, by the way he understood his role towards them positively. When it comes to ethical behavior, Confucius argued that ethical behavior followed adherence to these hierarchical systems and the respect for them, regardless of the the personal implications that could result as a result of following those relationships, things that could be dangerous to that person. There's a famous example that was given where the son is in the inferior position relative to his mother, who is in the superior position. So the son, if it is cold out, should use the warmth of his body to melt the ice and fish for his mother in a frozen lake, as opposed to letting her starve, even if it hurts him, right? Even if he suffers from the coldness of the ice, because he's working to protect his mother, and that's the admiration and respect in his relationship with her that overrides his well-being. Another example that's often held up as an example of somebody following the ethical behavior, the yi, despite personal implications, is the story of Yue Fei, who is one of a number of dead individuals who is ancestor worshipped, like the emperor Nya Tong that we saw before. Now, he was living about 1,000 years ago when there was the division between the northern Song, who had been defeated by the Jurchen Jin, who were barbarian invaders, who then created their own dynasty, the Liao dynasty of North China. And he was in the army of the southern Song, which was moving to attack the city of Kaifeng, which had been the historic capital of the northern Song, to liberate it from the Jin. And he may well have been able to be victorious at Kaifeng, but he was ordered by the emperor of the southern Song to turn back, because if Kaifeng were liberated and the northern Song were made independent again, it could create more conflict in China and disrupt the harmony. And so, of course, Yue Fei respected the view of his superior and returned back to the capital of the southern Song, despite the fact that he knew, or rather suspected, that he wouldn't live very long after doing so. And in fact, that was the case. He was executed um, in order to create a peace between the Southern Song and the Georgian Jin. Um, and his sacrifice, in order to promote harmony and the respect and admiration of his superior, the Emperor of the Southern Song, was a demonstration of him following the value of Yi. Um, There's a question as to whether or not these hierarchies are mostly, if not entirely, male dominated. Absolutely. Um, we'll continue the rest of this presentation after this slide next week, and I'll go to the question and answer. So the question that I have perfectly leads into who are those cardinal relationships. And the cardinal relationships are the ruler to the subject, the father to the son, the husband to the wife, the older brother to the younger brother, the older friend to the younger friend. And in each case, the superior has certain responsibilities to guide um, the to guide uh, the inferior, and the inferior has the responsibility of accepting the roles of the superior. When it comes to the question of Li and what Li is, it is the sets of rituals that people use to demonstrate that they're following the traditional norms and values, that they've cultivated the virtue within them. Because how are you going to demonstrate, except in that one instance where your mother is dying and you need to unfreeze the ice with your body? How are you going to demonstrate that you're actually going to follow these rules and relationships? How are you going to connect to other people? Well, that's through repetitive traditions. And in many ways, the traditions of the Zhou court were in some way recreated because in Confucius's mind, the failure of the present that he lived in, that which is called the spring and autumn period, where you had all these different states fighting against each other, was a direct result of abandoning the Zhou standards and the Zhou ethical behaviors and the Zhou rituals. And so while it didn't matter to do the exact same thing that the Zhou had done, to do something along the lines of showing this respect and creating these rituals to create the physical and emotional space to demonstrate that your mind was in the right place, that you were following the hierarchy, that you were respecting the relationships. This is the Li, the ritual behaviors of etiquette. And by doing these etiquette behaviors, you demonstrate that you're part of the system. And it goes back to that process of Sinicization, right? The process of becoming Han Chinese was through the eating of Chinese foods and the writing of Chinese calligraphy and the praying to Chinese gods and the eating with chopsticks and all of these different aspects that are themselves aspects of Li. Um, so these were acts to demonstrate that you were truly Chinese. Thank you for coming tonight. Questions, comments, please put those in the chat. If you want to raise your hand and talk, please do that. In the meantime, I'll tell you a little bit about our group. We are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard. You've been watching Eastern Asian Philosophy. Normally, we will be bi-weekly, but because we didn't finish this, I'll just cover the last part of that next week. We also have Asian Philosophy with Jason Peng, which I mentioned. Aaron and I do a periodic series on European Union security. As I mentioned, Jane Prendergast does her Beautiful, Powerful Women series. And periodically, Aaron and I will talk about current conflicts around the world, be they Ukraine, Israel, Ethiopia, Sudan, Burma. 2023 and into 2024 has been one of the most conflict-ridden times in the last 30 to 40 years. So it's a very interesting and sad place to be right now. And of course, we have our old series. I can't help but gush about my Middle Eastern Islamic history series and our other series that you can see on our website. So here are our meetup links and our YouTube links. And so for the questions. One of the questions so I'll take it from the top. There was a question about whether there will be a historic look at Southeast Asia, or is there one on our channel? Unfortunately, there isn't one on our channel. I am woefully unequipped to talk about Southeast Asia. I understand it in generalities, but it's a very different region, even though Vietnam is clearly part of Southeast Asia, and there will definitely be overflow into that discussion to the extent that Vietnam deals with, for example, Laos or Cambodia or Thailand, because Thailand controlled Laos and Cambodia for a long period of time. There will be discussions about that. There will certainly be discussions about how Southeast Asian states relate to East Asia. But Southeast Asia is incredibly complex, and it's a mixture of Hindu traditions, Buddhist traditions, Christian traditions and Islamic traditions all in the same place, um, creates an incredible cultural diversity. There's also an incredible linguistic diversity. Um, it's very rare that you have more than two countries that share the same linguistic origins. And in the case of Irian Jaya, which is the western part of the New Guinea island, you have also the Papuan languages, which are unrelated to anything outside of that island. So um, I feel unequipped, and unfortunately, I don't know anybody else who's doing that. There is There's a point that, with respect to the shame and the guilt, that familial enmeshment has long been extremely common in very large swaths of New England, even if perhaps not in other parts of the United States. I would agree that there are certain families in the United States, especially those families that have sort of name recognition, right? Like the Kennedys, or the Trumps, where actions taken by one member of the family have an effect on other members of the family. But by and large, the American experiment is about creating your own identity, right? We have a lot of literature about just rename yourself, move to a different city. You don't know anybody, nobody knows you. You're a free agent. And to a certain extent, they cannot run their own emotions, but but American society fundamentally is not about the relationships that you have with other people that you don't choose, right? You don't choose your parents, you don't choose your grandparents, you don't choose the town you grew up in, you don't choose the religion you grew up in, you don't choose the political party of everybody surrounding you. So those things don't matter in the same way as things that you do choose, like your friends, like your school, like your job, like your political party, like your house. Um, the organizations you choose to join, right? Everything is about uh, your choice as an individual and the markation of yourself as an individual. And in the West, that's seen as a very positive thing, that you should be your own person. And I mean, to the extent to which that actually happens, as opposed to, the Life of Brian sequence, let us all think differently, um, is certainly a question. But at the root, you have this sense of individuality that permeates the American experience. And to put ourselves in the East Asian space, we have to move outside of that perception and move into a perception of, no, the relationships that I cultivate as an individual are less important than those that were given to me. And the system that exists is the one that I should be a piece of, rather than my own sort of disharmonious person. And in the West, we value the disharmony, right? We value the idea that people can object to what other people are saying, and that through adversarial relationships we will find truth, right? That's why our court is set up the way it is. That's why our government is set up the way it is. At a fundamental level, we believe that individuals fighting with each other will come to the right answer. That's not the Chinese perspective, and it's not the East Asian perspective. The East Asian perspective, more generally, is that we find the person who has cultivated the right values, who knows the right answer, and we empower that person. Um, and we don't listen to the rabble, because what do they know? They should be in their position, and they should be doing the things that they are best trained for. And a 5-minute conversation with the average voter could convince many a Westerner that that system sounds better. Um, there's a question of, would you be able to compare the Roman and Chinese attitudes towards being the center of the world? And there's a similar question. I'm curious about your take on the comparison of China and Rome, as one can make the case China is what Rome would have been had it continuously reconstituted itself after numerous collapses, and whether much the same way China operates is more analogous to a Roman comparison than many smaller competing states that developed into Westphalian Europe. And similarly, how the reactions of the neighboring states to China was similar or different, using the Roman comparison rather than the Westphalian comparison. I think that the fundamental distinction between China and Rome being the centers of their respective worlds was the was the view towards barbarians, right? There was a sense in Rome, yes, that the barbarians were looked down upon, um, but there was a much greater sense that they could be incorporated. And while we have certainly cases of Romans moving out of Rome and settling in the various territories that they conquered, we can tell genetically that they made very little dent in most places outside of the Italic Peninsula. Um, the majority of the people of the Roman Empire were the indigenous people who adopted Roman custom. We can't say the same for China. We can say that there's certainly a mix of indigenous people and settlers, but it's far too genetically close in the case of China. In fact, most Chinese, regardless of whether they are from the North China Plain or other areas in China, are Y haplogroup O, whereas throughout the former Roman Empire, you have numerous different haplogroups. Group E, Group R, Group J. So it's much harder to say that definitively. And in fact, most of those genetics trace back to the Celtic migrations, which preceded Rome. But more to the point of Rome reconstituting and not and similar, I think that at a fundamental level, the Romans saw each other as a constitutive empire, that they were based in Rome and that they had territories outside of Rome, which is why you had contests in political policy between the different parts of the empire when it was split up, and you had the drive to split up the empire for administrative purposes. Um, so I don't really think that Rome saw itself as the only civilization. I think it just saw itself as the leader of civilization. And that creates a fundamental distinction. I also think that Rome interacted with China in a conception of equality, and Rome interacted with Persia in a conception of equality. Yes, the small individual tribes don't merit that sort of level of relationship, but when it came to the larger empires that could fight Rome, they did that. And even empires that necessarily didn't necessarily have the power to fight Rome, like Armenia. So I, I struggle to make the comparison, but maybe somebody who knows more about Rome than I do would be able to draw a better portrait. Um, there's a question: is jinn a demonic spirit? No, this is a language issue. So jinn in Arabic refers to a demonic spirit made of fire. Jin in the Chinese world refers to um, a specific lineage of rulers of the ethnic Jurchen people, who are people who are indigenous to uh, the area around Vladivostok in what's today Russia, but it is the easternmost part of Russia and other parts of Manchuria. Um, so the Jurchen Jin were not demons, although I'm sure Chinese chronologists at the time definitely described them that way. Um, but no, these were human nomadic tribesmen that entered through what is today Manchuria into Beijing and the surrounding area, and conquered it. And they created their own empire called the Liao. And that remained the North China imperial state for about 100 years before the Mongols conquered it. There's a question, could you please distinguish or draw a quick distinction between the terms to conquer, to settle, and to invade, maybe using the context of Taiwan and the Dutch, or Taiwan and China, or China and Vietnam? Okay, if I say that a territory was conquered, it means that a military force entered the territory and that it began to administer the territory as if it was a domestic or quasi-domestic territory. Um, if I use an American example, right, the US conquered Iraq. It moved military forces into Iraq. It began to establish it as a quasi US state entity. Um, Now, of course, it wasn't a US state, it was a military occupation. But but it was administering the territory, it was appointing governors and so on. Eventually, the US withdrew, but that's a good example of conquer. When I say to settle, I mean that they send human beings from the territory that they owned to the territory that they conquered. So a perfect example of that would be the development of the 13 colonies in the New World, right? You had territories. Uh, no, actually, a better example would be the Spanish colonization of Latin America, right? You had a territory that the Spaniards invaded and conquered, let's say Mexico, in the 1520s. Then you have Spain shipping people from the Iberian Peninsula to Mexico, and they start living there. That is settling. Whether or not the Spanish government is shipping them there or they just choose to move there, these are people who are moving and living in a place that is not their indigenous country. And they got there and they're allowed to go there because the country that they are indigenous to has now conquered that territory. And then finally, when I say invade, invade is, of course, the perception from the conquered people of the act of conquering, right? Um, that's a question of perception. So conquest, of course, is from the perception of the conqueror. Invade is from the perception of the indigenous population. I hope that helps. Um, And so we have this situation, right, as I mentioned, between China and Vietnam, where from the Vietnamese perception, they keep trying to set up an independent state, and China keeps invading and conquering. And from the Chinese perception, Vietnam is a Chinese province that keeps on rebelling and trying to eject Chinese presence. And so they're going to reinstitute order. There's a question on any presentation on history of Mongolia and South Asia. Same. Mongolia, I will cover because it does overlap to a significant degree with China, right? Because that relationship is very important. With regards to the history of um, South Asia is probably the most complicated place in the world. Um, and I don't think I would do it justice. So I don't feel. And with regards to family guilt, I'd submit it's far more common entrenched in more rural areas. Absolutely. No, I would agree that rural areas tend to be more traditional than places like a city, and therefore the idea of adaptability and changing identity and so on is a much more urban phenomenon anyway. So thank you everybody for coming. As I said, next week I will continue the rest of this presentation, and I look forward to seeing everybody. All right, bye.